For most of human history, night did not mean sleep. It meant vulnerability. When the sun disappeared, human vision weakened, the temperature fell, and the world quietly shifted toward the creatures that hunted best in darkness. Long before electricity or secure homes, our ancestors could only survive the night by staying close to one another and protecting a small, fragile fire. Even today, many people feel uneasy in complete darkness, as if an older instinct still lives somewhere deep in the brain. If night once belonged more to predators than to humans, then one quiet question remains. Why was 90% of human history afraid of the night? For most of human history, the end of daylight did not simply mean the beginning of rest. It meant the arrival of a different world. When the sun disappeared beyond the horizon, the landscape that had been familiar only hours before began to change in quiet and subtle ways. Colors faded first. The green of plants and the brown of soil slowly dissolved into shades of grey. Soon after, the shapes of rocks, trees, and distant hills became harder to separate from one another. What had been a visible environment during the day gradually turned into a space filled with uncertainty. For early humans who lived long before artificial light, this daily transformation was one of the most consistent experiences of life on Earth. The sun rose, the world became visible, and people moved through it with some degree of awareness. But when darkness arrived, that awareness narrowed sharply. The human eye, although excellent at seeing detail in daylight, struggles in near darkness. Compared with many nocturnal animals, humans have relatively limited night vision. The structure of the human retina contains far fewer of the cells that specialize in detecting faint light. As a result, once the sun set and the sky darkened, the distance a person could clearly observe became dramatically shorter. A landscape that might have been readable hundreds of meters away during the day could shrink to only a few uncertain shapes nearby. In such conditions, the environment itself seemed to close in. For early human groups who depended on observation to understand their surroundings, this loss of visual clarity had real consequences. During the day, a person could notice movement across open ground, identify animals at a distance, or recognize the outline of a safe path between rocks and trees. At night, those same abilities became far less reliable. Even familiar terrain could feel different once it was covered by darkness. Shadows merged together, depth perception weakened, and the small signals that usually helped humans interpret space were reduced. Researchers who study human evolution often note that our species is primarily adapted to daylight activity. Many human biological rhythms, including the internal circadian clock, are closely linked to the cycle of sunlight. For hundreds of thousands of years, human life followed this pattern: activity during daylight and reduced movement after sunset. Archaeological and anthropological evidence from hunter-gatherer societies suggests that daylight hours were typically used for travel, food gathering, tool-making, and social interaction. Night, by contrast, often brought a slower pace, yet slowing down did not automatically mean safety. When darkness spread across the land, the balance of the environment shifted in subtle ways. Animals that were difficult to observe during the day could move more freely. Sounds carried differently in cooler nighttime air. Small movements in the distance became harder to interpret. A rustling leaf or a distant call might signal nothing at all, or it might indicate the presence of another creature moving through the same space. For early humans, the difference between those possibilities could matter greatly. Living in small groups on open landscapes meant that awareness of the surroundings was always important. During daylight, the eyes provided most of that awareness. When the light disappeared, however, the information available to the human brain became far more limited. The world did not stop existing after sunset, but it became far more difficult to read. In this way, the arrival of night represented more than a simple change in lighting. It marked the moment when humans lost one of their most important tools for understanding the environment around them. The ground was still there, the trees were still standing, and the animals were still moving somewhere in the darkness. Yet without clear vision, the certainty that daylight once provided quietly faded away. And for a species that had evolved to navigate the world primarily through sight, that fading certainty may have been one of the earliest reasons that night felt fundamentally different from the day. As darkness continued to deepen after sunset, another subtle shift occurred in the way humans experienced the world. During the day, The human brain relies heavily on vision to interpret distance, movement, and shape. Much of our awareness of the environment comes from light reflecting off objects and entering the eyes. The brain then quickly organizes this visual information into a clear understanding of space. When light becomes scarce, however, this process becomes slower and less reliable. The brain begins to work with fragments instead of complete images. For early humans living long before modern shelter or artificial lighting, this change could happen very quickly each evening. As the sun moved lower in the sky, the landscape gradually lost its detail. Small variations in color that once helped separate objects from one another disappeared. Edges softened, and familiar shapes became harder to recognize. A tree branch might resemble an animal for a moment, while a rock might appear to move simply because the eye could not clearly define its outline. Researchers who study perception note that the human brain often attempts to fill in missing visual information when light is limited. This tendency helps explain why darkness can sometimes create uncertainty, even in places that are otherwise safe. The brain tries to predict what might be present beyond the limits of vision. For a species that evolved in environments where survival depended on noticing movement or potential threats, this predictive behavior likely had value. Yet it also meant that night could bring a constant sense of ambiguity. Something might be present just beyond the edge of sight, or it might not be there at all. In early human environments, this ambiguity had practical implications. Many landscapes where humans evolved contained dense vegetation, uneven terrain, and scattered obstacles. During daylight, these features were visible and could be navigated with care. After sunset, however, the same terrain became far more difficult to move through. A narrow path that had been easy to follow only hours earlier could disappear into darkness. Small changes in elevation might be missed until a person stepped onto them. In such conditions, even simple movement required greater caution. Anthropologists studying traditional hunter-gatherer societies have often observed that nighttime travel is usually limited unless there is a strong reason to move. Although modern tools like flashlights make darkness easier to manage today, early humans did not have access to such devices for most of their history. Without reliable light sources, the safest choice after sunset was often to remain near a familiar location. This behavior appears in many cultures that live close to natural cycles of light and dark. The quiet hours of night become a time for reduced movement, conversation, or rest, rather than exploration of unknown terrain. Another factor that made night different from day was the way sound began to take on greater importance. When vision weakens, the human brain naturally pays more attention to other senses. Even a faint noise can suddenly draw attention when the surrounding environment is difficult to see. The snapping of a small twig, the movement of leaves in wind, or the distant call of an animal may all become signals that the brain attempts to interpret. Because early humans depended on awareness of their surroundings for survival, listening carefully during darkness likely became an important skill. Over time, this shift from visual to auditory attention may have shaped the way humans experience nighttime environments. In daylight, information about the world arrives quickly through sight. In darkness, knowledge comes more slowly through scattered sounds and uncertain shapes. The landscape still exists, but it must be understood through a different set of signals. For a species that had evolved to read the world primarily through vision, this nightly transition meant that each sunset quietly changed the balance between certainty and uncertainty in the human experience of the natural world. As night settled more completely across the landscape, early human groups likely experienced another important change. The world became quieter, but also more uncertain. During daylight hours, movement across the land created constant visual signals. Animals grazing in the distance, birds flying overhead, and people walking across open ground all produced patterns that the eye could easily detect. Even when something moved far away, the brain could often identify it quickly because light carried clear visual information. When darkness arrived, many of these signals disappeared. The environment did not become empty, but it became harder to interpret. Movement still occurred beyond the limits of vision, yet the eye could no longer confirm what was happening. Anthropologists who study human perception often note that the brain prefers clear patterns. When those patterns vanish, the mind begins to rely on smaller clues. In darkness, these clues often come through sound or subtle motion nearby. A faint rustling in vegetation may signal a small animal searching for food, The distant call of a bird might mark the movement of something larger passing through the environment. But these signals rarely provide complete information. They offer fragments rather than certainty. For early humans living in open or semi-open landscapes, this shift meant that the surrounding world continued to operate while remaining partially hidden. Many animals that shared the same environments as early humans were well adapted to activity during twilight or night. Some possessed vision that allowed them to detect faint movement in low light. Others relied on smell or hearing to locate prey or avoid danger. Humans, by contrast, were far more dependent on daylight. Studies of human anatomy show that our species lacks many of the physical features associated with strong nocturnal adaptation. The human eye can adjust somewhat to dim light, but it cannot match the night vision of animals that evolved specifically for darkness. As a result, when night covered the land, the balance of awareness between humans and other animals may have shifted. The environment that had once been visible and understandable became a place where information arrived slowly and incompletely. For small groups of early humans, this likely encouraged behavior that reduced exposure to the unknown, remaining near familiar ground, staying close to other members of the group, and limiting unnecessary movement during darkness would have increased the chances of avoiding injury or surprise encounters. Evidence from ethnographic studies of modern hunter-gatherer societies suggests that nighttime activity often centers around places where people feel secure, such as campsites or resting areas that are already known to the group. These locations provide stability when the surrounding environment becomes difficult to read. The land beyond those areas may still contain pathways, water sources, and useful resources, but reaching them safely becomes far more challenging without daylight. Over many generations, experiences like these may have shaped how humans interpreted the arrival of night. Darkness was not simply an absence of sunlight. It marked a transition between two different ways of experiencing the world. During the day, humans could rely on wide visual awareness to understand their surroundings. After sunset, that awareness narrowed to the immediate space around the body and the small signals carried by sound. The broader landscape remained present but hidden, continuing its rhythms beyond the limits of human sight. For a species that evolved to explore, gather food, and move across land in daylight, this daily transformation likely carried an important lesson. The world did not become less active at night. It simply became more difficult for humans to observe. And when the ability to observe weakens, the sense of certainty that usually accompanies daylight begins to fade. As the night environment grew darker and harder to interpret, another important truth about the human species becomes clearer. Humans are not naturally built for darkness. Many animals that share the earth with us possess physical traits that allow them to function effectively when light is scarce. Some have eyes that collect even the faintest reflections of moonlight. Others rely on highly sensitive hearing or smell to understand their surroundings. Humans, by contrast, are primarily a daylight species. Much of our biology reflects this long evolutionary history under the sun. The structure of the human eye offers one example. The retina contains two main types of cells that respond to light. One group allows humans to see detail and color in bright conditions. The other group is more sensitive to dim light, but does not provide the same sharp resolution. Humans possess far more of the cells designed for daylight vision than those optimized for darkness. This arrangement works extremely well when sunlight is present. It allows people to distinguish subtle colors, identify distant objects, and recognize faces with remarkable precision. Yet the same system becomes less effective when light levels drop significantly. As evening turns to night, the human eye must rely more heavily on its limited capacity for low light detection. Shapes become less defined, color nearly disappears, and movement becomes harder to interpret at a distance. Researchers who compare human vision with that of nocturnal animals often emphasize how large this difference can be. Many animals that hunt or move at night have anatomical features that improve their ability to detect faint light. Some possess a reflective layer behind the retina that helps gather and amplify available illumination. Others have pupils that open extremely wide, allowing more light to enter the eye. Humans do not possess these particular adaptations. Instead, the human visual system evolved to perform best in environments where daylight provides abundant illumination. This difference in visual ability helps explain why the experience of darkness can feel so limiting for people. When the sun disappears, the human brain must operate with far less information than it normally receives during the day. The landscape may still contain the same features, but they are no longer easily visible. The horizon becomes difficult to read, distances grow uncertain, and the boundaries between objects begin to blend together. Even the sky changes in ways that affect perception. During daylight, the bright sky creates clear contrast between objects and the background behind them. At night, that contrast is reduced. Clouds, trees, and distant terrain may all appear as similar dark shapes against a darker sky. Anthropologists who examine the daily rhythms of early human societies often note that this visual limitation likely shaped patterns of behavior. Daylight offered the conditions needed for long-distance travel, tool use, and the search for food. When darkness arrived, those activities became far more difficult. The safest approach was often to reduce movement and remain within a small, familiar area. Over long periods of human history, this pattern may have repeated itself thousands of times for every individual life. The sun rose, the world became visible, and people moved outward into the landscape. Later, the sun disappeared and visibility narrowed again. The same biological features that allowed humans to thrive in bright daylight quietly reminded them each evening that their species had limits once the light faded. The limitations of human night vision become easier to understand when we compare the human eye with the eyes of animals that regularly move through darkness. Many nocturnal creatures evolved in environments where finding food, avoiding predators, or navigating terrain required the ability to detect very small amounts of light. Over long periods of evolutionary time, their bodies developed structures that allow them to gather and process faint illumination far more efficiently than humans can. One of the most noticeable differences appears in the size and behavior of the pupil. In low light, the pupil expands to allow more light to enter the eye. Human pupils can widen, but the change is modest compared with many animals that are active at night. Cats, for example, possess pupils that can open dramatically in darkness, allowing them to capture much more available light. This adaptation helps them detect movement even when illumination is extremely weak. Humans, by contrast, gain only a limited improvement when the pupil expands. The eye becomes slightly more sensitive, yet the overall clarity of vision remains restricted. Another difference involves the balance of cells within the retina. As mentioned earlier, the human retina contains a large number of cells specialized for daylight vision. These cells allow people to perceive detail and color with remarkable precision when light is abundant. However, they contribute less when illumination fades. Nocturnal animals tend to have a different balance, with a greater number of cells that respond strongly to dim light. These cells do not produce detailed color images, but they are highly sensitive to movement and contrast in darkness. Because of this arrangement, many night-active animals can detect the motion of prey or predators even when the environment appears nearly black to human observers. Researchers studying comparative vision often point out that the human eye represents a compromise suited for daytime activity. It is capable of adjusting to dim light after some time, a process known as dark adaptation. But this adjustment takes many minutes and never reaches the sensitivity seen in species specialized for nocturnal life. Even after full dark adaptation, humans still struggle to identify distant shapes or subtle movement in very low light. This limitation likely influenced how early humans behaved when darkness arrived. The natural environment did not become empty at night. Instead, it continued to host many forms of activity that were simply more difficult for humans to observe. Small animals might search for food among plants, while larger animals moved quietly through the same terrain that humans use during the day. Because the human visual system could not easily detect these movements, early human groups may have experienced the nighttime landscape as unpredictable. Anthropological observations of present-day hunter-gatherer communities provide useful insights into how people respond to such conditions. In many of these societies, nighttime movement is cautious and often limited to familiar areas around temporary camps or shelters. The reason is practical rather than mysterious. When visibility decreases, the ability to anticipate obstacles or detect animals also declines. Staying near known surroundings reduces the chance of unexpected encounters. This behavior does not necessarily imply constant danger, but it reflects a realistic awareness of the limits imposed by darkness. Over long spans of human history, such patterns likely became part of daily routine. Daylight opened the world outward, allowing humans to travel, gather resources, and observe the broader environment. Night, in contrast, narrowed the field of awareness to the immediate space nearby. In this way, the biological design of the human eye quietly shaped how our ancestors experienced the cycle between light and darkness. Even beyond the structure of the eye itself, several other features of the human body reveal how strongly our species is connected to daylight conditions. One of the most important of these features is the internal biological clock that regulates cycles of wakefulness and rest. In humans, this system is closely linked to the presence and absence of natural light. As sunlight fades in the evening, chemical signals within the brain begin to prepare the body for rest. When light returns in the morning, those signals gradually shift again, encouraging alertness and activity. This rhythm, often called the circadian cycle, appears in many living organisms, but in humans it is particularly sensitive to patterns of daylight. For most of human history, before artificial lighting existed, this cycle would have been shaped almost entirely by the rising and setting of the sun. Anthropologists studying traditional societies that live with minimal electric light often observe daily routines that follow the natural rhythm of daylight. People tend to wake near sunrise, when the environment becomes visible and the temperature begins to rise. Activity then spreads across the daylight hours, gathering food, traveling across land, repairing tools, and interacting socially within the group. As the sun moves lower in the sky, movement gradually slows. The fading light signals that the environment will soon become harder to navigate. Over thousands of generations, such patterns may have reinforced the biological connection between human activity and daylight conditions. The body expects light during waking hours and darkness during rest. This does not mean that humans cannot function at night, but it does suggest that nighttime activity has historically required greater effort or caution. Researchers who examine sleep patterns across cultures have noted that humans often respond to darkness not only with physical tiredness, but also with changes in alertness and mood. In natural settings without electric lighting, the transition from day to night can feel gradual but unmistakable. The sky dims, temperatures cool, and sounds within the environment begin to shift. For early human groups, these changes likely signaled the closing of one phase of the day and the beginning of another. Because the body itself is influenced by the daily light cycle, night may have been experienced not simply as darkness, but as a biological signal that the time for outward activity was ending. This connection between light and human physiology highlights another reason why darkness may have carried special meaning in early environments. When the body becomes less active, and the senses receive less information from the surroundings, awareness naturally narrows. Instead of scanning distant landscapes or moving across open terrain, attention focuses on the immediate space nearby. Social interaction, quiet conversation, or rest may begin to replace the outward movement of the day. Ethnographic studies of communities living close to natural light cycles sometimes describe evening gatherings around shared spaces where people talk, prepare food, or maintain fires before eventually sleeping. Such gatherings offer a way to remain socially connected even when the broader environment becomes difficult to see. In this way, the biological rhythms of the human body and the environmental rhythm of daylight appear to reinforce one another. The sun provides the illumination needed for exploration and work, while darkness encourages a slower pace and reduced movement. Over long periods of human history, these patterns likely shaped the daily structure of life. The world did not stop after sunset, but the human body and senses were far less suited to interacting with it in the same way as during the day. For a species whose eyes, brain rhythms, and behavior all align closely with daylight, the arrival of night quietly marked a moment when human capability became more limited. As daylight disappeared and the abilities of human vision weakened, the environment did not simply become quieter. Instead, the balance of activity across the landscape often shifted toward creatures that were more comfortable in darkness. Many ecosystems contain animals that are most active during the cooler hours of evening and night. These patterns are not random. Moving after sunset can offer several advantages for animals, especially in regions where daytime temperatures are high or where avoiding human or other daytime predators is beneficial. Over long periods of evolution, numerous species developed behaviors that allowed them to navigate and hunt effectively in low light. In many parts of Africa, where some of the earliest humans evolved, several large predators are known to increase their activity after sunset. Lions, for example, often hunt during the night or in the hours just after dusk and before dawn. The cooler temperatures make movement easier for large animals, and the reduced visibility can help predators approach prey more closely before being detected. Other carnivores, such as hyenas or certain wild dogs, may also travel and forage during the darker hours. These patterns do not mean that the entire landscape suddenly fills with predators every night. However, they do suggest that nighttime environments can contain forms of activity that differ significantly from those of the day. For early human groups moving through open plains, forests, or mixed landscapes, the presence of such animals likely shaped how people behaved after sunset. During daylight, humans often rely on sight to maintain awareness of distant movement. If a large animal appears across an open field, it can often be seen long before it approaches closely. This ability to observe from a distance gives humans time to adjust their behavior, whether by changing direction, remaining still, or gathering together. Darkness reduces this advantage. When visibility shrinks, the distance at which movement can be detected also becomes shorter. An animal moving quietly through tall grass or vegetation might remain unseen until it is relatively close. Anthropological research suggests that early humans were not defenseless against predators. Groups could cooperate, use tools, and eventually control fire, all of which provided protection in many situations. Yet these advantages depended strongly on awareness. Detecting potential threats early allowed groups to react effectively. When darkness limited that detection, the margin for response naturally became smaller. In such conditions, caution and group coordination would have become especially valuable. Many traditional societies that live near wildlife today show similar patterns of behavior. People often remain attentive to the sounds and movements of animals during the night, particularly in regions where large predators still exist. Livestock may be kept close to human settlements, and fires or lights may be used to discourage animals from approaching. Although modern technology offers many new forms of protection, the basic principle remains the same. Reduced visibility changes how humans interact with their environment. In the distant past, before villages, walls, or permanent lighting existed, this relationship between darkness and animal activity likely carried even greater importance. The land surrounding a human group did not become empty after sunset. Instead, it remained active in ways that humans could not easily observe. For a species whose survival often depended on noticing movement across open terrain, this nightly shift may have encouraged a more careful relationship with the hours of darkness. Night did not necessarily mean constant danger, but it did represent a time when the balance of awareness between humans and other creatures was less certain than during the day. As darkness settled more fully across the landscape, another quiet shift began to take shape in the relationship between humans and other animals. During the day, humans often possessed a subtle advantage that came from observation. The ability to see across open ground, identify movement in the distance, and recognize the outlines of animals allowed early human groups to make decisions before danger came close. A distant herd might signal a hunting opportunity, while the appearance of a large predator could encourage the group to change direction or gather together. These choices depended heavily on time and distance. If something could be seen early enough, people had the opportunity to respond calmly. At night, however, that buffer of distance often became much smaller. The natural world continued to move, but many of those movements occurred beyond the limits of human sight. An animal traveling through tall grass or low vegetation might remain almost invisible until it reached the edge of the small area illuminated by moonlight or starlight. Even then, its outline might appear only as a faint shift of shadow rather than a clearly defined shape. Researchers who study predator behavior frequently note that many carnivores rely on surprise to capture prey. Approaching quietly and remaining unseen for as long as possible increases the chance of success. Darkness naturally supports this strategy. When prey animals cannot easily detect movement at a distance, the hunter gains a greater opportunity to close the gap. This dynamic likely existed long before humans appeared, shaping the behaviors of predators across many ecosystems. When early humans began moving through these same environments, they entered a world where this pattern was already established. During daylight, humans could partly offset the advantage of predators through cooperation and observation. Groups of individuals scanning the environment together could notice threats from multiple directions. Tools such as spears or throwing weapons added further protection once a predator was detected. But the effectiveness of these strategies depended strongly on awareness of the surroundings. If the first sign of danger appeared only when an animal was already nearby, the available time to react could be much shorter. Anthropologists studying modern wildlife interactions sometimes emphasize that large predators rarely seek conflict with humans directly. Many animals prefer to avoid unfamiliar creatures when possible, yet encounters can still occur when animals and humans move through the same territory, especially when visibility is limited. In such moments, both sides may be reacting to incomplete information. A predator might approach cautiously, uncertain of what lies ahead, while a human group might hear movement without knowing its source. This mutual uncertainty may have shaped how humans perceived nighttime environments over long stretches of evolutionary history. Darkness did not guarantee danger, but it created conditions where the usual signals that clarified the environment were reduced. The shapes of animals blended with vegetation, and the sounds of movement carried unevenly through the air. In these circumstances, early human groups may have relied more strongly on behaviors that increased awareness and safety, remaining close together, choosing resting places carefully, and paying close attention to unfamiliar sounds. Ethnographic studies of communities living near wildlife today sometimes describe similar nighttime habits, where people stay attentive to the surrounding environment even while resting. Such patterns suggest that the human response to darkness may reflect a long history of adjusting behavior when observation becomes more difficult. Over many generations, these experiences may have quietly reinforced the idea that night represented a time when the balance of information between humans and the wider natural world became less predictable. As the hours of darkness continued through the night, the difference between day and night in the natural world became even more apparent. During daylight, many animals that humans depended on for food could often be seen moving across open terrain. Herd animals grazed in visible areas, birds moved across the sky, and the patterns of animal movement were easier to observe and remember. Early human groups likely learned these patterns carefully, recognizing when certain animals were active and where they tended to travel. Such knowledge helped hunters and gatherers move through their environment with greater confidence. Yet these visible rhythms changed once the sun disappeared. Some animals reduced their movement and rested, while others began to travel more actively. In many ecosystems, twilight and nighttime represent important periods for hunting, feeding, and territorial movement. Researchers studying wildlife behavior frequently observe that animals adjust their activity to balance several needs at once. They must find food, avoid their own predators, and conserve energy. For certain species, the cooler temperatures and reduced visibility of nighttime provide conditions that make these tasks easier. As a result, the landscape that humans experience during daylight could behave differently after sunset. Paths that appeared quiet during the day might become routes for animals moving between feeding areas. Open spaces where humans once observed grazing herds might later host predators searching for prey under the cover of darkness. For early humans, this shift meant that the environment did not simply become hidden at night. It also followed patterns that were harder to predict through sight alone. Anthropological studies of present-day hunter-gatherer societies sometimes note that people living close to wildlife remain aware of these patterns, even when they cannot see them directly. Knowledge of animal calls, movement sounds, and environmental cues helps people interpret what may be happening beyond the visible range. Such awareness often develops through long familiarity with the landscape. Over many years, individuals learn which sounds signal common animals and which might indicate something less familiar. Even with this experience, however, darkness still limits the ability to confirm what lies beyond the immediate surroundings. This limitation likely influenced how early human groups approached the night. Remaining close to known resting place, staying near companions, and maintaining awareness of nearby sounds would have helped reduce uncertainty. Archaeological evidence from ancient campsites sometimes shows that human groups repeatedly returned to particular locations that offered shelter, visibility, or access to resources. These locations may have served as stable points within landscapes that otherwise became difficult to navigate in darkness. In such places, the group could gather, share warmth, and remain attentive to the surrounding environment while the wider landscape continued its nighttime activity beyond the edge of sight. Over thousands of generations, experiences like these may have shaped the human understanding of night as a time when the familiar world became partially hidden. The same ground remained beneath one's feet, and the same animals still moved through the terrain, yet the signals that made the environment readable during the day were greatly reduced. For a species whose survival depended heavily on recognizing movement, distance, and shape through sight, this daily transition likely carried an important lesson about the limits of human perception. Night did not erase the natural world. It simply revealed how much of that world existed beyond the reach of human vision once the light faded. As the limits of human vision became clear in darkness, and the surrounding landscape continued to move in ways that were difficult to observe, early human groups appear to have relied on one resource that remained dependable even when the environment was uncertain: the presence of other people. Long before permanent villages or cities existed, humans already lived in small social groups. These groups were not only important for hunting, gathering food, or caring for children, they also provided security in environments where individual awareness could be limited. During daylight hours, cooperation allowed humans to observe the landscape from multiple directions at once. Several individuals scanning the horizon could notice changes that a single person might miss. When night arrived and visibility narrowed, this shared awareness likely became even more valuable. Instead of depending on one pair of eyes or ears, a group could combine the perceptions of many individuals. A faint sound heard by one person might be noticed by another, and the group could respond together. Anthropologists who study hunter-gatherer societies often emphasize how strongly human survival depends on cooperation. Unlike many animals that live solitary lives, humans evolved as a social species. Communication, shared attention, and coordinated behavior allowed early groups to manage challenges that would have been difficult for individuals alone. This social structure may have been especially important during the night, when the environment offered fewer visual clues about what was happening nearby. When people gather closely together, the surrounding space can be monitored from several positions at once. Even if each individual has limited visibility, the group as a whole may maintain a broader awareness of the immediate area. The physical arrangement of people within a group can also influence how secure a resting place feels. If individuals are positioned near one another, any unusual sound or movement can be noticed quickly by multiple members of the group. This shared vigilance does not require constant alarm. Instead, it allows the group to distribute attention naturally across the environment. One person might remain quietly alert while others rest, and awareness can shift gradually as individuals move or wake. Ethnographic observations of modern hunter-gatherer communities sometimes reveal similar patterns of nighttime behavior. In many such societies, sleeping areas are organized in ways that keep members of the group close together. People may rest near a central space where conversation or quiet activity continues for some time after sunset. Even when individuals fall asleep, others may remain partially awake, listening to the sounds of the environment or tending small tasks. Researchers who examine sleep in group-living species sometimes refer to this pattern as collective vigilance. When several individuals share a resting place, the chances increase that someone will notice unusual changes in the surroundings. This system does not require constant wakefulness from every member. Instead, awareness passes naturally among individuals as they shift positions, wake briefly, or respond to environmental cues. For early humans living without permanent shelter or modern lighting, such patterns may have provided a practical response to nighttime uncertainty. The environment beyond the group could still contain animals or unexpected movement, but the presence of companions reduced the likelihood that these events would go unnoticed. In this way, the human tendency to gather together after sunset may reflect more than social preference. It may also represent a long-standing strategy for maintaining awareness when the natural world becomes harder to observe. Over many generations, the simple act of staying close to others during the night may have helped human groups remain connected to the environment even when darkness limited what any single individual could see. When humans gather closely together during the night, the environment around them begins to feel different from the wide openness of the daytime landscape. During daylight hours, people often spread out across larger areas while searching for food, exploring terrain, or moving between locations. Each individual may walk several meters apart from others, observing the ground, plants, or distant animals. This spacing allows the group to cover more ground and gather information from a wider field of view. Yet as darkness arrives and the limits of vision become more apparent, such spacing becomes less practical. The same distance that felt comfortable during the day may feel uncertain at night, when shapes and movement are harder to interpret. Closing that distance brings a sense of shared awareness. When people rest close together, The signals that one person notices can easily reach the others. A whispered word, a small gesture, or even a subtle shift in posture can communicate attention to something happening nearby. Anthropologists who observe group-living societies often note how naturally humans adjust their physical arrangement depending on the environment. In unfamiliar or uncertain conditions, individuals tend to move closer to one another without needing formal instruction. This pattern appears in many different cultural settings and may reflect a deeply rooted aspect of human social behavior. For early humans living in open landscapes without permanent shelters, gathering together at night may have helped create a small zone of stability within a much larger environment. The immediate space around the group could be monitored collectively, while the world beyond that circle faded into darkness. In such moments, awareness of the environment may have shifted from distant observation to careful listening and quiet attention to nearby signals. The presence of others also changes how people interpret unfamiliar sounds. A sudden noise in darkness might feel alarming when heard alone, yet the same sound can be interpreted more calmly when several individuals hear it together. One person may recognize the sound of wind moving through vegetation, while another might identify the call of a familiar animal. Through shared experience, the group gradually forms a clearer understanding of what is happening in the surrounding landscape. This process reduces uncertainty without requiring anyone to fully see the source of the sound. Ethnographic studies of communities living close to natural environments often describe evening periods where people sit together for conversation, storytelling, or quiet work near a shared space. These gatherings usually take place after the day's movement has slowed and before the group fully settles into sleep. Such moments allow individuals to remain socially connected while maintaining awareness of the surroundings. Even simple activities like speaking softly or tending a small task can help people remain alert to subtle changes in the environment. For early human groups, these shared nighttime spaces may have served several purposes at once. They offered companionship after the long efforts of daylight activity, but they also created a stable center within an uncertain environment. Beyond the edge of that shared space, the wider landscape continued its rhythms of movement and sound. Animals traveled through vegetation, wind shifted across the ground, and distant calls echoed through the darkness. Within the group, however, people could rely on each other's presence to interpret those signals together. Over many generations, this pattern of gathering closely at night may have reinforced the idea that safety and understanding were strongest when humans remained connected to one another, while the surrounding world became harder to see. As the night deepened, and early human groups settled into their resting places, another subtle pattern may have emerged within these gatherings. Even when people intended to sleep, it is unlikely that every individual in the group became fully unaware of the surroundings at the same moment. In environments where darkness limited visibility and the natural world remained active beyond the edge of sight, maintaining some degree of awareness could still be important. Anthropologists and sleep researchers who study group-living societies have observed that sleep within social groups often occurs in overlapping cycles rather than in perfect synchronization. Some individuals fall asleep quickly, while others remain awake a little longer. Later, those who slept earlier may wake briefly while others continue resting. Over the course of the night, these small shifts create a pattern where at least a few members of the group are awake or partially alert at any given time. This arrangement does not necessarily require deliberate planning. Instead, it can arise naturally from differences in individual sleep rhythms, age, comfort, or the subtle disturbances that occur in shared sleeping spaces. When several people rest in close proximity, small movements or sounds often cause brief awakenings. A person might adjust position, check the surroundings, or listen for a moment before returning to sleep. These short periods of awareness contribute to what researchers sometimes describe as a distributed form of vigilance within social groups. Rather than assigning a single guard to remain awake throughout the entire night, the group collectively maintains awareness through these natural variations in sleep. Ethnographic studies of traditional communities occasionally note similar patterns. In some groups, people wake briefly during the night to tend fires, speak quietly, or check on children before returning to rest. These activities are usually calm and routine rather than urgent, yet they also ensure that the group remains loosely connected to its environment throughout the dark hours. Even a small movement near the sleeping area might be noticed by someone who happens to be awake at that moment. This pattern could have offered practical advantages for early humans living in open or lightly sheltered environments. Darkness reduced the range of human vision, and the sounds of animals or shifting wind might occasionally signal changes in the surrounding landscape. If every member of the group slept deeply at the same time, those signals could pass unnoticed. But when sleep occurs in overlapping cycles, the chances increase that someone will briefly register unusual sounds or movement. The group does not need to remain constantly alert in a state of tension. Instead, awareness rises and falls gently among individuals throughout the night. Over long stretches of human history, such patterns may have helped early groups remain connected to their environment, even while resting. The natural rhythm of shared sleep, combined with the closeness of companions, created a system where observation continued in quiet, intermittent moments. In this way, the human tendency to sleep near others may reflect more than comfort or social bonding. It may also represent a subtle adaptation to living in environments where darkness limited vision but did not stop the wider natural world from continuing its activity. Long before cities illuminated the night, and long before lamps or electricity existed, humans discovered a simple but powerful way to push back against darkness: fire. The control of fire is often considered one of the most important turning points in human history. Archaeological evidence suggests that humans were regularly using fire hundreds of thousands of years ago. Although researchers continue to study exactly when and how early humans first learned to maintain it, sites discovered across Africa, the Middle East, and parts of Europe show traces of ancient hearths, burned bones, and layers of ash left behind by repeated fires. These remains suggest that fire was not merely encountered in nature, but deliberately tended and preserved by human groups over long periods of time. Fire offered several advantages that were especially meaningful once daylight disappeared. The most immediate benefit was light. Even a small flame can illuminate the nearby ground, revealing objects that would otherwise remain hidden in darkness. Stones, branches, tools, and the shapes of companions become visible again within the glow of the fire. Although the range of this light is limited compared with daylight, it creates a small space where human vision can once again operate more effectively. In an environment where most of the surrounding landscape becomes difficult to see at night, this illuminated area provides a stable center for the group. Fire also produces warmth. During the night, especially in open environments, temperatures can drop quickly after sunset. The warmth generated by a fire helps make resting areas more comfortable and may have allowed human groups to remain active in regions that would otherwise become too cold during the dark hours. Anthropologists studying prehistoric sites often observe that hearths appear repeatedly in places where humans returned over many generations. These hearths suggest that fire was not simply a tool used occasionally, but a central feature of many early human camps. Another important effect of fire involves the behavior of animals. Many animals naturally avoid approaching open flames. The brightness, heat, and movement of fire can signal danger, encouraging animals to keep their distance. While fire does not guarantee safety from all wildlife, it may reduce the likelihood that certain animals will move directly into the space occupied by humans. This effect could have been especially valuable during nighttime, when human vision alone offered limited awareness of the surrounding environment. The presence of a fire creates both a visible boundary and a sensory signal that extends beyond the immediate circle of light. Even animals outside the illuminated area may notice its warmth or shifting glow. Because of these combined effects, light, warmth, and deterrence fire may have transformed the way early humans experienced the night. Instead of being surrounded entirely by darkness, a group could create a small island of visibility and comfort within the larger environment. People sitting or resting near the fire could see one another, observe nearby ground, and maintain awareness of subtle movements at the edge of the light. Anthropologists sometimes describe this illuminated space as a gathering point, where social interaction could continue after sunset. Conversation, quiet activity, and shared attention to the fire itself may have filled the early hours of darkness before sleep. The flickering light of flames would have cast moving shadows across the ground and nearby objects, reminding those present that beyond the reach of the firelight, the wider landscape still existed, active yet largely unseen. In this way, fire did not eliminate the uncertainties of night, but it gave humans a way to shape a small portion of the darkness into a place that felt more familiar and manageable. Although fire offered light and warmth, Its presence also introduced a new responsibility for early human groups. Unlike sunlight, which returns each morning without effort, a fire must be maintained. A flame can fade quickly if it is not fed with fuel, and once it disappears it may be difficult to recreate without the proper materials and knowledge. Archaeological evidence suggests that early humans often carried embers from one location to another, or carefully protected a fire so that it could continue burning through the night. This behavior indicates that fire was not simply a temporary convenience, but something valuable enough to guard and sustain. Maintaining a fire required attention to the environment. Fuel had to be gathered during the day, often in the form of dry branches, plant fibers, or pieces of wood. These materials were then arranged so that the flame could continue burning steadily. If too little fuel was added, the fire might shrink and eventually go out. If too much material was placed on the flame at once, the fire could produce heavy smoke or burn unevenly. Over time, early humans likely developed practical knowledge about how to manage these variables, learning which types of wood burned slowly and which ignited more easily. Such knowledge would have been passed between members of the group and across generations. When evening arrived and the group gathered around a fire, its steady glow represented not only warmth, but also the effort that had gone into sustaining it. The circle of light produced by a small fire is limited. Beyond a few meters, the surrounding ground quickly fades into shadow, yet within that illuminated space, the fire transforms the environment in subtle ways. Faces become visible again, tools can be handled with greater confidence, and the ground nearby can be inspected for obstacles. In a world where darkness normally restricts vision, this modest expansion of visibility may have felt significant. The fire did not restore daylight, but it created a small zone where human perception could function more comfortably. Ethnographic studies of traditional communities often describe how the presence of a shared fire shapes nighttime gatherings. People may sit in a loose circle, facing toward the flame while speaking quietly or tending small tasks. The light allows individuals to see each other's expressions and gestures, reinforcing the sense of connection within the group. Meanwhile, the surrounding darkness remains present just beyond the edge of the firelight. This contrast between illuminated space and shadow may have given the fire an additional psychological role. Within the circle of light, people could feel oriented and aware of one another. Outside it, the larger landscape continued its quiet activity beyond sight. For early humans, tending a fire may also have provided a simple structure to the nighttime hours. While some members of the group rested, others might briefly adjust the fuel, move a piece of wood, or watch the embers to ensure the flame remained alive. These small actions required little energy but helped keep the fire stable until morning. Through such routines, the group maintained the fragile boundary between the visible and the unseen. Over many generations, the presence of fire likely became closely associated with the experience of night itself. Darkness still surrounded human camps, but the flame offered a focal point where people could gather, rest, and maintain a connection to their immediate surroundings. In this way, fire did not remove the uncertainties of the nighttime environment. Instead, it allowed early humans to shape a small portion of that environment into a place where visibility, warmth, and shared awareness could briefly return. As the fire continued to burn through the night, its influence extended beyond light and warmth. The steady glow of a flame also changed the way humans organized the space around them. In darkness without fire, the surrounding environment can feel undefined, with no clear center or boundary. When a fire burns, however, the illuminated ground begins to form a recognizable area where activity takes place. People naturally position themselves within this space, facing the light and remaining close enough to feel its warmth. Over time, this arrangement may have shaped the structure of early human camps. The fire became a central point around which daily life gathered once the sun had disappeared. Archaeological sites from different regions of the world often reveal patterns that support this idea. At many prehistoric campsites, researchers have found concentrations of burned material, ash layers, and stone tools clustered around ancient hearths. These discoveries suggest that fire served as a focal point for repeated human activity. Tools were repaired nearby, food was sometimes prepared close to the flame, and groups likely gathered in the same area during evening hours. The presence of a central fire created a predictable place where members of the group could return after the movements of the day. When darkness covered the surrounding landscape, that shared location offered both familiarity and orientation. Within the glow of the fire, the environment became readable again, in small but meaningful ways. The ground could be examined for objects, companions could be recognized easily, and small movements near the edge of the light might still be noticed. Just beyond that boundary, however, the wider landscape remained largely hidden. This contrast between visible space and surrounding darkness may have influenced how humans interpreted the night itself. The firelight revealed a small portion of the world, while reminding people that much of it remained unseen. Ethnographic observations of traditional communities sometimes describe how people naturally form loose circles around a fire. This arrangement allows each person to see the flame and the faces of others, while maintaining awareness of the darker surroundings beyond. In such settings, attention moves easily between conversation within the group and quiet listening to the environment. The fire becomes a point where social life and environmental awareness meet. Stories may be shared, tools adjusted, or food prepared, all while the group remains attentive to the sounds and movements beyond the light. Anthropologists often suggest that the social role of fire may have been as important as its practical benefits. The hours after sunset provided a time when movement across the landscape slowed, allowing people to remain in one place together. In this shared space, communication, learning, and the exchange of knowledge could occur in ways that were difficult during the busier daylight hours. Younger members of the group might listen as older individuals describe places, animals, or events remembered from the past. Skills related to tool use or survival could be discussed while the group remained gathered in the warmth of the fire. Through such moments, the firelight may have helped shape the rhythm of human social life. Over long stretches of human history, this simple technology likely transformed the experience of night from complete darkness into a more structured environment. The flame did not eliminate the unknown beyond its glow, but it provided a center where people could remain connected to one another and to their surroundings. In doing so, fire allowed humans to face the night not as isolated individuals, but as members of a group sharing a small, illuminated space within the larger darkness. As the circle of firelight defined a small area of safety within the surrounding darkness, another process continued quietly within the human mind. The brain itself had been shaped over many generations by the need to interpret uncertain environments. Long before written history, the survival of early humans depended not only on physical strength or tools, but also on the ability to notice subtle signals that something in the environment had changed. A faint sound, a shift of movement, or an unfamiliar shape could sometimes indicate an important event. Because of this, the human brain developed systems that respond quickly to uncertainty. Researchers in neuroscience often describe these systems as part of the brain's threat detection network. Certain regions of the brain continuously monitor sensory information for patterns that might signal potential danger. When something unusual appears, such as a sudden noise or unexpected movement, the brain can trigger a rapid shift in attention, even before the conscious mind fully understands what has occurred. This response does not always mean that danger is present. Instead, it represents a precautionary reaction that encourages the body to become alert. In bright daylight, the brain usually receives clear visual information that helps it evaluate such signals quickly. A rustling sound in the grass may be followed by the visible movement of a small animal, allowing the brain to identify the source of the noise. Once the object becomes visible, the sense of uncertainty fades. At night, however, the situation changes. Darkness reduces the amount of visual information available, making it harder for the brain to confirm what caused a sound or movement. When the source cannot be clearly identified, the brain may continue to treat the signal as uncertain for longer periods. In evolutionary terms, responding cautiously to uncertain signals may have offered advantages. If an unusual sound sometimes indicated the presence of a predator or another threat, paying attention to that signal could increase the chances of avoiding harm. Even if many such signals turned out to be harmless, the occasional real threat would have reinforced the value of remaining attentive. Over long periods of human evolution, these patterns of response may have become deeply embedded in the way the brain processes unfamiliar or incomplete information. Anthropologists and psychologists studying human perception often note that the brain tends to prioritize detection of possible threats over complete accuracy. In other words, It may be safer to react to a possible danger that turns out to be harmless than to ignore a signal that later proves important. This tendency can influence how humans interpret environments where sensory information is limited. Darkness naturally creates such conditions. When vision weakens and sounds carry unevenly through the air, the brain receives fewer clear signals about what is happening nearby. Instead, it must work with fragments, brief sounds, faint shapes, or subtle changes in the environment. For early humans gathered around a small fire or resting in darkness, this situation may have encouraged a heightened sensitivity to the surrounding world. People might pause when hearing a distant call, glance toward a shifting shadow at the edge of the firelight, or listen carefully to the wind moving through vegetation. These reactions do not necessarily indicate fear in the dramatic sense often imagined today. Rather, they represent a quiet form of attentiveness shaped by long experience with environments where awareness could matter. Over many generations, such responses may have influenced how humans emotionally experienced the night. Darkness did not only limit vision, it also invited the brain to remain watchful in the absence of clear information. When the human brain encounters an environment where information is incomplete, it often begins to rely more strongly on prediction. Instead of waiting passively for clear signals, the mind attempts to interpret fragments of sensory input and imagine what might be present beyond the limits of perception. This ability allows humans to respond quickly to potential changes in the environment, but it also means that the brain sometimes fills in gaps with possibilities rather than confirmed observations. In bright daylight, predictions are usually corrected almost immediately by clear visual information. A shadow on the ground can be identified as a moving branch once the eye examines it closely. A distant sound can be linked to a visible animal crossing the landscape. Light provides enough detail for the brain to test and revise its interpretations quickly. At night, however, that process becomes slower and less precise. When darkness removes many visual cues, the brain must work with smaller pieces of information. A faint sound may suggest movement somewhere beyond the edge of sight, but the exact source remains uncertain. A shifting shadow at the boundary of firelight might represent a passing animal, the movement of leaves, or simply the changing angle of the flame. Because the brain evolved to remain attentive to possible threats, it may briefly treat these ambiguous signals as meaningful until more information becomes available. Researchers studying human perception often note that this pattern reflects a balance between caution and efficiency. If the brain waited for complete certainty before responding to unusual signals, it might react too slowly in situations where quick awareness is valuable. By allowing tentative interpretations to form early, the mind maintains a state of readiness, even when the environment cannot be clearly observed. This mechanism does not require conscious effort. It operates quietly within the background processes of perception and attention. Anthropological perspectives on early human life suggest that such cognitive tendencies would have been particularly relevant during nighttime conditions. When early humans gathered around small fires or rested within dimly lit camps, the surrounding environment extended far beyond the range of clear visibility. Sounds carried through the darkness, sometimes echoing across open ground or filtering through vegetation. In these moments, the human brain likely continued its natural effort to interpret the limited signals that reach the senses. A distant animal call might prompt someone to pause and listen more carefully. The rustling of leaves could lead a person to glance toward the edge of the illuminated area. These responses reflect not panic, but attentiveness, shaped by the uncertainty of the environment. Modern psychological studies sometimes describe this tendency as pattern detection. Humans are particularly skilled at noticing patterns in the world around them, even when those patterns are incomplete. This ability supports many forms of learning and problem-solving, yet it also means that the brain may occasionally perceive meaning where none exists. In daylight, additional information quickly clarifies the situation. In darkness, the absence of visual confirmation allows those interpretations to persist for longer periods. Over many generations, such experiences may have influenced how humans perceive the night itself. Darkness created conditions where the brain remained active in its search for meaning while receiving only fragments of information. The mind listened carefully, watched the boundaries of the firelight, and interpreted subtle signals from the environment. Through this quiet process, the night became a time when the brain balanced between observation and imagination, guided by instincts shaped across long stretches of human evolution. Over long stretches of human history, the interaction between darkness and the human brain likely created a particular kind of nighttime awareness. This awareness did not always involve immediate danger, yet it encouraged people to remain quietly attentive to their surroundings. The brain's sensitivity to uncertain signals meant that even small changes in the environment could draw attention. A sudden silence among insects, a distant call from an animal, or the faint crack of a branch might all be noticed more quickly in darkness than during the busy hours of daylight. In daylight, the human brain processes enormous amounts of visual information at once. The eyes continuously send detailed images of the surrounding landscape, allowing the brain to focus on movement, color, and shape across wide distances. This constant flow of information keeps attention directed outward toward many different objects at the same time. When night arrives, that visual stream becomes greatly reduced. Instead of scanning a broad landscape, attention often narrows to the immediate area within reach of limited light or moonlit ground. This narrowing of perception changes how the brain distributes its attention. Rather than monitoring distant visual signals, it becomes more sensitive to nearby sounds and subtle movements. Researchers who study attention sometimes note that the brain is capable of shifting between different modes of awareness depending on environmental conditions. In bright settings, perception tends to expand outward, gathering information from a wide field of view. In darker environments, perception becomes more focused, concentrating on smaller signals that might otherwise be overlooked. For early humans living in natural landscapes without artificial lighting, this shift would have occurred every evening as the sun disappeared. The brain adapted to the changing conditions by adjusting how it interpreted sensory input. Ethnographic observations of people living in environments with minimal artificial light often reveal similar experiences. As darkness settles across the landscape, people naturally become more attentive to sounds that might go unnoticed during the day. The rustle of wind in leaves, the distant movement of animals, or the shifting of companions nearby can all become part of the nighttime soundscape. Listening becomes a primary way of understanding the environment. Even while resting or speaking quietly, individuals may remain aware of these background signals. This kind of attentiveness does not necessarily produce constant anxiety. Instead, it represents a calm readiness, shaped by long experience with environments where darkness limits vision. People may continue conversations, prepare food, or sit quietly near a fire while still remaining connected to the sounds beyond the circle of light. Over generations, this balance between rest and awareness may have become a familiar aspect of nighttime life. The brain learns to remain partially attentive even while the body relaxes. Such patterns may help explain why many humans today still respond strongly to unexpected sounds in the dark. A sudden noise in a quiet nighttime environment can quickly capture attention, even when there is no real threat present. The brain's reaction reflects ancient systems designed to notice unusual signals when visual information is limited. These systems developed long before modern lighting allowed people to move comfortably through darkness. In the distant past, the ability to notice subtle changes in the environment may have helped early humans remain aware of the natural world that continued moving around them after sunset. Darkness, therefore, did not simply remove information from the senses. It also encouraged the human mind to listen, interpret, and remain quietly attentive to the rhythms of the environment beyond the edge of sight. As darkness settled across early human camps and the brain adjusted to the quieter signals of the night, another important aspect of human life began to unfold: sleep. For modern people living in brightly lit cities, sleep often appears as a long, continuous block of rest that fills the night. Yet the experience of sleep for humans living in natural environments may have been somewhat different. Without artificial lighting, the transition between wakefulness and sleep likely followed the gradual rhythm of sunset, darkness, and eventual dawn. Anthropologists and sleep researchers studying traditional communities have often observed that sleep in environments without electric light tends to begin earlier and align closely with the natural cycle of daylight. When the sun disappears and the temperature begins to fall, people gradually slow their activities. Conversations become quieter, movement across the landscape stops, and individuals settle into resting places. However, the moment when people lie down does not always mark the immediate arrival of deep sleep. In many cases, there may be a period of quiet wakefulness as the body relaxes and adjusts to the cooler nighttime environment. This gentle transition from activity to rest may have been common for early humans who gathered near fires or resting areas after sunset. The human sleep system itself is composed of several stages that repeat in cycles throughout the night. These cycles include lighter phases of sleep and deeper phases in which the body becomes less responsive to external stimuli. Researchers studying sleep patterns across cultures have noted that humans often experience brief awakenings during the night, even when they do not fully remember them later. These awakenings may last only a few moments before the person returns to sleep. In modern environments filled with artificial light and structured schedules, such brief interruptions are often overlooked or quickly forgotten. In natural settings, however, these short periods of wakefulness may have played a subtle role in maintaining awareness of the surroundings. When individuals wake briefly during the night, they may instinctively listen to the environment before returning to rest. In early human groups sleeping near one another, these moments of wakefulness may have overlapped among different members of the group. While some people slept deeply, others might awaken for a short time, shift position, or glance toward the fading embers of a fire. These quiet adjustments allowed the group to remain loosely connected to the environment, even while resting. Anthropologists studying hunter-gatherer societies sometimes describe nighttime periods where people awaken briefly to tend fires, speak softly, or simply observe the surroundings before falling asleep again. These awakenings are typically calm and routine rather than alarming. They reflect the natural rhythm of human sleep rather than a response to constant threat. For early humans living in environments where darkness limited vision but the natural world remained active, such sleep patterns may have been practical. Instead of entering a single, uninterrupted state of deep sleep for the entire night, the group remained connected through a gentle cycle of rest and occasional awareness. This rhythm allowed people to recover energy while still maintaining a quiet link to the environment beyond their resting place. Over thousands of generations, sleep itself may have become closely intertwined with the changing conditions of night. The body rested, but the mind remained capable of briefly returning to awareness when unusual sounds or movements occurred nearby. As the night progressed and early human groups moved gradually between sleep and brief wakefulness, the pattern of rest within the group may have taken on a quiet rhythm. Unlike the modern expectation that everyone sleeps deeply for the same continuous period, sleep in shared environments often unfolds in overlapping cycles. Some individuals fall asleep quickly after settling down, while others remain awake for longer stretches, speaking quietly or watching the fading glow of a fire. Later in the night, those who slept earlier may wake briefly while others continue resting. Over the course of several hours, this natural variation can create a situation in which someone within the group is awake or lightly attentive during many moments of the night. Researchers who study sleep in social species sometimes describe this phenomenon as staggered vigilance. The idea is not that individuals deliberately take turns standing guard, but that differences in sleep timing naturally distribute moments of wakefulness across the group. These variations arise for many reasons. Age, physical condition, and personal habits can influence how quickly someone falls asleep or how easily they wake during the night. Environmental factors also play a role. The sound of wind moving through vegetation, the shifting of embers in a fire, or the quiet movement of another person nearby may cause a brief awakening. When several individuals share the same sleeping space, these small disturbances can ripple gently through the group, creating moments when someone becomes aware of the surroundings before returning to rest. Anthropologists observing communities that live close to natural light cycles have noted similar patterns. In some groups, people awaken occasionally during the night to adjust bedding, speak quietly with a nearby companion, or add fuel to a small fire. These actions usually take only a few moments before the person settles back into sleep. The overall atmosphere remains calm, yet the group never becomes completely disconnected from the environment. Even a faint sound in the distance might be noticed by someone who happens to be awake at that moment. For early humans living without permanent shelters or modern lighting, such patterns may have offered practical benefits. Darkness limited visual awareness, but the presence of several individuals resting together increased the chances that unusual sounds or movements would be noticed. A person who briefly awakened might listen to the surrounding environment, confirm that everything remained quiet, and then return to sleep. In this way, awareness circulated gently among the members of the group without requiring anyone to remain fully alert throughout the entire night. The group's connection to the environment continued through these small intervals of attention. Over long periods of human history, this shared rhythm of sleep may have shaped how people experienced nighttime. The hours of darkness were not simply a long pause between days. Instead, they formed a gradual cycle of rest, quiet conversation, brief awakenings, and attentive listening. Within the circle of companions and perhaps near the fading glow of a fire, the group could recover energy while still remaining loosely aware of the natural world beyond their resting place. This balance between rest and awareness may have allowed early humans to navigate the uncertainties of night without constant tension, relying instead on the gentle flow of wakefulness that passed naturally from one person to another. As the hours before dawn slowly approached, the rhythm of rest within early human groups likely continued to follow this gentle pattern of overlapping sleep and brief awareness. Some individuals might have remained in deeper stages of sleep, recovering from the physical effort of the day's travel and work. Others might awaken momentarily, shift position, or glance toward the dim glow of embers before settling again into rest. These small awakenings were rarely dramatic events. Instead, they formed a quiet background rhythm that helped maintain a subtle connection between the group and the surrounding environment throughout the night. Researchers who examine sleep patterns across different cultures often emphasize that human sleep is naturally flexible. The body does not always remain in one continuous state of unconsciousness for many hours. Instead, sleep unfolds through repeating cycles that include lighter and deeper stages. During lighter stages, the brain remains capable of responding to sounds or movement nearby. Even without fully waking, the mind may register changes in the environment. This sensitivity likely allowed early humans to remain partially connected to the world around them while still receiving the restorative benefits of sleep. In environments where darkness limited vision and the wider landscape continued to move with animals and shifting weather, such responsiveness may have been useful. A distant call from an animal or an unusual sound in nearby vegetation could momentarily draw attention before the sleeper returned to deeper rest. These responses did not require full alertness. Instead, they represented a quiet readiness shaped by long experience with nighttime environments. Anthropologists studying small-scale societies sometimes observe that sleep in communal spaces allows individuals to remain socially connected even while resting. The breathing of companions, the movement of someone turning in their bedding, or the soft crackling of a fire can all become familiar sounds that signal stability within the group. When such sounds remain consistent, the environment feels predictable. If a new or unusual sound appears, however, it may briefly interrupt the rhythm of sleep. Someone might listen for a moment before deciding that the disturbance poses no immediate concern. Over time, these small adjustments help maintain the balance between rest and awareness. In early human camps, the presence of several people sleeping nearby may have contributed to a shared sense of security. The group did not depend entirely on one individual remaining awake. Instead, awareness passed quietly among members as they moved through their natural sleep cycles. This distributed pattern allowed the group to recover energy while still remaining loosely attentive to the environment beyond their resting place. By the time the first faint light of morning began to appear in the sky, the rhythm of the night was gradually coming to an end. As dawn approached, the visual world slowly returned. Shapes that had remained hidden in darkness began to reappear, and the horizon once again provided clear information about the surrounding landscape. For early humans, this daily return of light likely marked the moment when the balance between uncertainty and observation shifted back in their favor. The group could rise, stretch, and prepare to move outward into the environment once more. In this way, the night served not only as a period of rest, but also as a time when the human body and mind remained gently connected to the rhythms of a world that continued to exist beyond the limits of sight. When the darkness of night reduces, what the eyes can see, another sense gradually becomes more important in helping humans understand the world around them. Hearing. During daylight hours, the human brain receives so much information through vision that many sounds fade into the background of awareness. A person walking through a landscape may focus primarily on what appears ahead, while the steady noise of wind, insects, or distant animals blends quietly into the surrounding atmosphere. Once darkness arrives, however, the balance between the senses begins to change. When vision becomes limited, the brain often turns more attention towards sound. In natural environments, nighttime can produce a complex soundscape made up of many different signals. Insects create steady rhythms across grasslands or forests, wind moves through leaves and branches, and animals call to one another across distance. Each of these sounds carries information about the surrounding landscape. Even when the source cannot be seen, careful listening can reveal clues about what is happening beyond the limits of sight. For early humans living without artificial lighting, this shift toward auditory awareness likely occurred every evening. As daylight faded and the visual landscape narrowed, the sounds of the environment may have taken on greater significance. A distant call from an animal could indicate movement across open ground. The sudden silence of insects might signal the approach of a larger creature. Even the rhythm of footsteps from a nearby companion could help maintain orientation within the group. Anthropologists studying communities that live close to natural environments often note how skilled people become at recognizing these patterns. Individuals learn to distinguish the common background sounds of a familiar landscape from unusual or unexpected noises. Over time, these subtle distinctions become part of everyday awareness. Researchers in sensory perception suggest that the human brain is highly adaptable in how it processes information from different senses. When one sense becomes less reliable, the brain can increase its attention to others. This flexibility helps explain why people sometimes feel that sounds are clearer or more noticeable in darkness. In reality, the sounds themselves may not have changed significantly. Instead, the brain is allocating more attention to auditory information because visual input has decreased. For early human groups resting near fires or gathered in small camps, this change in perception could influence how the night was experienced. Conversations might pause briefly when an unfamiliar sound carried through the darkness. Someone might tilt their head slightly to listen more carefully before deciding whether the sound represented something ordinary or something new. These small moments of listening did not necessarily indicate fear. They simply reflected the natural adjustment of human perception when vision became limited. Ethnographic observations sometimes describe evening gatherings where people sit together quietly, listening to the surrounding environment while speaking softly or tending small tasks. In such moments, the sounds of the landscape become part of the shared experience of night. The group remains connected not only to one another but also to the wider environment through the subtle signals carried by sound. In this way, hearing becomes a bridge between the illuminated space of human activity and the darker world beyond. Over thousands of generations, this nightly shift in sensory attention may have shaped how humans perceived the hours after sunset. When the eyes could no longer read the landscape clearly, the ears continued to gather information from the surrounding world. Through listening, early humans remained aware that the natural environment was still active, even when much of it could no longer be seen. As hearing becomes more important in darkness, the human brain begins to process sounds in a slightly different way than it does during the day. When the eyes provide clear information about the environment, sounds are often interpreted quickly because their sources can be seen. A branch snaps, and the eye immediately identifies a person or animal moving nearby. A distant call echoes across the landscape, and the visible presence of birds or animals explains the sound. Vision acts as a guide that helps the brain confirm what the ears have detected. At night, this confirmation is often missing. The brain hears the sound, but the source may remain hidden beyond the limits of sight. In such moments, the mind must rely on the characteristics of the sound itself. The direction from which it arrives, the rhythm of the noise, and the way it changes over time all become clues that help interpret what might be happening in the environment. Researchers studying auditory perception note that humans are surprisingly skilled at estimating the direction of a sound. Even without seeing the source, the brain can often determine whether a noise came from the left, the right, or somewhere behind the listener. This ability depends on small differences in how sound waves reach each ear. Because the ears are positioned on opposite sides of the head, a sound arriving from one direction reaches one ear slightly before the other. The brain processes this difference almost instantly, allowing a person to turn their attention toward the source. In darkness, this directional sensitivity becomes particularly valuable, A person sitting near a fire or resting among companions may hear a movement somewhere beyond the visible edge of the camp. By listening carefully, they may estimate the direction and distance of the sound, even without seeing what produced it. Anthropologists observing communities that live in natural environments often describe how people respond quietly to such signals. Someone might pause in conversation, listen briefly, and then continue speaking if the sound proves familiar. In other cases, the group might fall silent for a moment, while individuals listen more closely. The sound of wind moving through grass, for example, produces a different rhythm than the footsteps of an animal crossing the same area. Over time, individuals learn to recognize these patterns through repeated experience with their surroundings. Darkness can also change the way sound travels across the landscape. Cooler nighttime air often allows certain sounds to carry farther than they do during the day. The absence of daytime activity, such as the movement of many animals or the noise of insects in sunlight, may also make individual sounds more noticeable. As a result, a distant call or the breaking of a branch can sometimes travel across surprisingly large distances in quiet nighttime conditions. For early humans, this acoustic environment may have provided valuable information about what was happening beyond the visible area around their camp. A call from an animal might reveal the presence of wildlife moving across the landscape. The sound of other humans could signal nearby groups traveling through the same region. Even the shifting of wind across vegetation might indicate changes in weather or the movement of larger animals disturbing the ground. In this way, the human ear helped extend awareness beyond the limits of firelight and starlight. Although darkness reduced what the eyes could see, the surrounding world continued to communicate through sound. By listening carefully, early humans could remain connected to that world even when much of it remained hidden from view. As the night continued and the surrounding landscape remained hidden in darkness, the sounds of the environment often formed a kind of background rhythm that early humans gradually learned to recognize. In many natural ecosystems, nighttime is filled with repeated acoustic patterns. Insects may produce steady, continuous tones across fields or forests. Certain birds or animals call at regular intervals. Wind moves through leaves and grass with familiar variations depending on its strength. These repeating sounds create what researchers sometimes describe as an environmental baseline, a collection of noises that become normal and predictable over time. When people spend long periods living within the same landscape, they begin to recognize this baseline almost without thinking about it. The brain becomes familiar with the ordinary sound patterns of that place. Because these sounds occur repeatedly and follow recognizable rhythms, they rarely demand focused attention. Instead, they form a kind of quiet backdrop, against which other signals can be noticed more easily. Anthropologists studying communities that live close to natural environments often note how quickly individuals recognize when this background pattern changes. A sudden silence among insects, for example, may signal that something has disturbed the environment. Many insects stop producing sound when they sense movement nearby. In such cases, the absence of a familiar noise may become more noticeable than the noise itself. Similarly, an unfamiliar animal call or an irregular movement through vegetation may stand out against the steady nighttime background. For early humans resting near campsites or fires, these subtle shifts in the soundscape may have served as gentle indicators that something in the environment had changed. The brain does not need to analyze every detail of the sound. Instead, it simply registers that the familiar pattern has been interrupted. A person might pause briefly, listen to the darkness beyond the edge of the firelight, and then return to rest if the sound proves ordinary. Researchers in neuroscience often explain that the human brain is especially sensitive to unexpected changes in patterns. When sensory input follows a predictable rhythm, the brain gradually reduces the attention it gives to that signal. This allows mental resources to remain available for detecting new or unusual information. When a pattern suddenly changes, whether through a new sound or the disappearance of an expected one, the brain quickly redirects attention to investigate the difference. In daylight, such changes might be noticed visually. At night, however, sound often becomes the primary signal that something has shifted in the environment. Ethnographic observations sometimes describe how groups sitting quietly at night will briefly pause when the soundscape changes. Conversations may stop for a moment while people listen. If the environment quickly returns to its usual rhythm, the group relaxes and resumes normal activity. These pauses may last only seconds, yet they demonstrate how humans remain connected to the surrounding world through sound, even when vision cannot provide clear information. Over long periods of human history, learning to recognize the rhythms of nighttime sound may have helped early groups maintain awareness of their environment while resting. Darkness did not silence the landscape. Instead, it revealed a different layer of information carried through subtle shifts in the soundscape. By listening to these patterns, humans could sense when the familiar balance of the environment remained stable and when something new might be moving through the darkness beyond the limits of sight. As early humans learned to listen to the rhythms of the nighttime, environment, another important aspect of human experience gradually emerged: the emotional response to uncertainty. Darkness did not only change how the senses gathered information, it also influenced how the human mind interpreted what it could not fully see. When the brain receives incomplete signals from the environment, it often reacts with a heightened state of alertness. This response is not necessarily dramatic or overwhelming. Instead, it reflects a quiet readiness that encourages attention to possible changes in the surroundings. Psychologists who study human emotion often describe fear as a protective response shaped by long evolutionary history. Fear does not exist only to create discomfort. Its primary function is to encourage caution when the brain detects signals that might indicate risk. In natural environments where early humans lived for most of their history, uncertainty itself could be meaningful. If a sound could not be easily explained, or if movement occurred beyond the limits of vision, paying attention to that uncertainty increased the chances of responding appropriately. Over time, this relationship between uncertainty and caution may have shaped how humans emotionally experience darkness. During daylight, the environment provides abundant information that helps the brain evaluate what is happening nearby. People can see distant animals, observe terrain clearly, and identify objects across large spaces. These visual signals allow the mind to confirm or dismiss potential concerns quickly. At night, however, many of these signals disappear. The brain must interpret sounds, shadows, and fragments of sensory input without the clarity provided by full daylight. In such conditions, a cautious emotional response may help maintain awareness of the environment. Anthropologists studying the development of human behavior sometimes suggest that emotional reactions evolved alongside practical survival strategies. The feeling of unease in uncertain environments may encourage individuals to remain attentive rather than careless. This does not mean that early humans lived in constant fear of the night. Instead, it suggests that the mind may have treated darkness as a situation requiring greater awareness. People sitting near a fire or resting with companions could still feel calm and comfortable, yet the wider landscape beyond the firelight remained difficult to observe, and the brain continued monitoring subtle signals that might indicate movement or change. Modern psychological research sometimes demonstrates similar patterns in how humans react to limited information. When people cannot clearly see their surroundings, they often become more attentive to sounds or small visual cues. The mind begins to imagine possible explanations for what lies beyond immediate perception. This process is a natural feature of human cognition, rather than a flaw. The brain attempts to prepare for different possibilities until clearer information becomes available. For early humans living without artificial lighting, these experiences may have repeated themselves thousands of times across many generations. Each evening brought the gradual fading of daylight and the return of an environment where much of the landscape remained hidden. In this setting, the emotional response to darkness may have become intertwined with the practical need to remain aware. Fear, in its quieter and more cautious form, could serve as a signal that the environment required careful attention. Rather than representing weakness, this response may have helped early humans maintain the balance between rest and vigilance that nighttime conditions demanded. As humans spent more time navigating uncertain environments, the emotional response associated with caution gradually became linked to certain situations more strongly than others. Darkness was one of those situations. When the visual landscape faded and the brain received fewer clear signals about what was happening beyond the immediate surroundings, the mind often treated the environment with greater care. This response did not necessarily appear as intense fear. More often, it may have taken the form of quiet vigilance, a subtle shift in awareness that encouraged people to pay closer attention to unfamiliar sounds, movements, or changes in the environment. Researchers studying human emotion frequently note that the brain tends to respond more strongly to uncertain threats than to known ones. When the source of a stimulus is clearly visible, the brain can evaluate the situation quickly. If the object is harmless, the sense of alertness fades almost immediately. But when the source cannot be seen or confirmed, the brain may maintain attention for a longer period. Darkness naturally creates this type of condition. Without clear visual information, even ordinary sounds or movements may require a moment of interpretation before they can be understood. Anthropologists sometimes describe this response as an adaptive form of caution. In natural environments, reacting carefully to uncertain signals could increase the likelihood of avoiding danger. For early humans moving through landscapes shared with many other animals, this response may have encouraged behaviors that reduced risk. People might remain closer to companions, choose resting places more carefully, or limit movement until daylight returned. These behaviors do not require constant anxiety. Instead, they reflect an awareness that the environment contains elements that cannot be fully observed. Over many generations, this relationship between darkness and attentiveness may have shaped cultural practices as well. Ethnographic studies from different regions of the world often describe nighttime routines that emphasize calm gathering and reduced travel after sunset. People tend to remain near known areas such as camps, shelters, or communal spaces where companions are present. Conversation, storytelling, and quiet tasks may fill the hours before sleep. These activities keep the group together, while the wider landscape remains hidden beyond the reach of light. In such settings, the emotional response to darkness becomes balanced by the presence of others and the familiarity of the environment. Modern psychological experiments sometimes reveal how strongly the human mind responds to situations where visibility is limited. When participants are placed in dimly lit environments, they often become more sensitive to small changes in sound or movement. Even harmless stimuli can capture attention more quickly than they would in bright conditions. Researchers interpret these reactions as part of the brain's natural strategy for dealing with incomplete information. The mind remains prepared to respond until the source of the signal can be confirmed. For early humans living without artificial lighting, such experiences likely formed part of everyday life. The night returned each evening, bringing with it a world that continued to move beyond the limits of sight. Within that world, the human brain balanced between calm rest and attentive awareness. The feeling that modern people sometimes describe as fear of the dark may therefore reflect a deeper evolutionary pattern, an inherited tendency to treat uncertain environments with care. Rather than representing an irrational reaction, this emotional response may have helped generations of humans remain attentive to the natural world when the landscape became harder to see. As this quiet form of caution repeated itself night after night across countless generations, the human mind may have gradually learned to associate darkness with a particular kind of awareness. The landscape did not become dangerous every evening, yet the conditions of night consistently required the brain to interpret the world with less information. Over time, these repeated experiences may have strengthened the connection between darkness and careful attention. When people entered dim environments, the mind automatically shifted into a mode of observation shaped by long evolutionary history. This response does not require conscious effort. It operates through systems in the brain that evolved to monitor changes in the environment. Researchers studying human cognition often describe how the brain continuously evaluates sensory information for patterns that might signal meaningful events. When the environment provides clear signals, such as the bright visual detail of daylight, the brain can process those patterns efficiently and move on. When the signals are incomplete, however, the brain tends to remain attentive for longer periods. Darkness naturally produces this situation because it reduces the amount of visual detail available to the senses. Anthropological perspectives suggest that this pattern of response may have influenced how early humans experienced the night emotionally. Sitting near companions around a small fire, people could feel calm within the shared space of light and warmth. Yet beyond the edges of that circle, the wider landscape remained largely hidden. The brain recognized that something might still be moving in those unseen areas, even if there was no immediate evidence of danger. This awareness created a subtle tension between comfort and uncertainty. Within the group, the environment felt familiar and manageable. Outside the group's immediate space, the environment remained open to possibilities that could not be fully observed. Modern psychological research sometimes refers to this type of response as anticipatory awareness. the brain prepares for possible changes even when no clear threat is present. Rather than waiting for an event to occur, the mind maintains a gentle readiness to notice new information. In evolutionary terms, this readiness may have been valuable. A person who noticed unusual movement early could alert others or adjust behavior before the situation became serious. Although such responses might occasionally prove unnecessary, the cost of paying attention was usually small compared with the potential benefit of early awareness. Over thousands of years, this pattern of cautious attentiveness may have become woven into the human relationship with darkness itself. Night represented a time when the senses worked differently and when the brain relied more heavily on incomplete signals. The emotional tone associated with this experience may have varied from calm watchfulness to mild unease, depending on the situation. Yet the underlying process remained consistent. Darkness invited the mind to remain alert to possibilities beyond the limits of sight. Even today, when artificial lighting has transformed the way humans experience nighttime environments, traces of this ancient pattern can still appear. People often notice unfamiliar sounds more quickly in the dark than in daylight. A quiet rustle in a dim room may capture attention even when it has a simple explanation. These reactions may reflect the long history of human adaptation to environments where darkness reduced certainty, but did not remove the need for awareness. As the patterns of caution, listening, and shared rest shaped how early humans moved through the night, another question naturally appears. How did people organize the space where they spent those hours of darkness? For groups living long before permanent buildings or artificial lighting, the choice of where to settle at night could influence how comfortable and secure the group felt until morning. Archaeological evidence suggests that early human camps were often arranged with careful attention to the surrounding landscape. The location itself mattered. Groups frequently chose areas that offered some natural advantage, such as a slight elevation, nearby rock formations, or vegetation that provided shelter from wind. These features could help create a resting place that felt more stable than the open terrain beyond. When the sun disappeared and visibility dropped, familiarity with the immediate surroundings became especially important. A well-known campsite allowed people to move carefully even in dim light, reducing the risk of stumbling over unseen obstacles or wandering into unfamiliar ground. Within these chosen locations, the arrangement of the group may have followed patterns shaped by both practical needs and social habits. Archaeological sites containing ancient hearths often reveal clusters of stone tools, animal bones, and other traces of human activity surrounding the area where fires once burned. These patterns suggest that the fire frequently served as a central point within the camp. People gathered near it during evening hours, and activities such as preparing food or repairing tools often took place within its reach. When night arrived, the same central location likely became the place where individuals settled to rest. The fire provided light, warmth, and a visible reference point within the darkness. By resting near the fire, the group could remain oriented within the camp even when the surrounding landscape disappeared into shadow. Anthropologists studying traditional camps sometimes observe similar arrangements. People often rest in positions that allow them to remain close enough to companions for communication while still leaving space for individual comfort. This layout can form a loose circle or cluster around a central feature such as a fire. Within this shared space, the group remains connected while the environment beyond fades into darkness. The physical structure of such camps may have also influenced how people perceived the night. Inside the immediate resting area, the environment felt organized and familiar. Each person knew where companions were located and could easily recognize their voices or movements. Outside the camp, however, the landscape remained largely unseen. Sounds from the surrounding terrain reached the group, but their sources often stayed hidden beyond the edge of the firelight. In this way, the camp formed a boundary between two different kinds of experience. Within the group's space, people could rest, speak quietly, and share warmth. Beyond that boundary, the wider world continued its nighttime activity outside the reach of human vision. Over long periods of human history, such spatial arrangements may have helped early humans manage the uncertainties of darkness. By organizing their resting places around central features and familiar surroundings, groups created small environments that felt predictable, even when the larger landscape remained hidden. These camps did not remove the challenges of night, but they allowed humans to shape a portion of the environment into a place where cooperation, awareness, and rest could exist together until the return of daylight. Once a resting place had been chosen, and the group gathered around a central fire or familiar space, the structure of the camp itself began to influence how people experience the night. In daylight, a landscape often feels open and continuous. People move through wide areas while gathering food, following animal tracks, or traveling between water sources and shelter. At night, however, the boundaries of human activity become much smaller. The immediate area of the camp becomes the center of attention, while the surrounding land gradually fades into darkness. Within this smaller space, the arrangement of people and objects takes on greater importance. Archaeological studies of ancient campsites sometimes reveal that tools, food remains, and sleeping areas were often clustered around hearths in ways that suggest repeated patterns of use. Over time, early humans likely learned how to organize these spaces in practical ways. Sharp tools might be placed where they could be reached easily but safely. Pieces of wood or plant material for the fire could be kept nearby so the flame could be maintained during the night. Resting places might be positioned where individuals could remain close to the warmth of the fire, while still leaving enough space for others to lie down comfortably. These practical arrangements created a form of nighttime order within the camp. Even when darkness covered the wider landscape, the immediate surroundings of the group remained predictable. People knew where objects were located, where companions were resting, and where the edge of the illuminated area began. This familiarity allowed the group to move carefully within the space if someone needed to adjust the fire, check the surroundings, or change position during the night. Anthropologists who study temporary camps among modern hunter-gatherer groups sometimes describe how quickly people become familiar with the layout of a shared space. After spending several hours in one place, individuals learn the positions of tools, bedding, and companions almost instinctively. This knowledge reduces the need for visual confirmation in low light. Someone waking briefly in the night may recognize the location of others simply by listening to breathing or small movements nearby. The camp becomes a place where memory and familiarity help replace the visual clarity that daylight normally provides. The edge of the camp, however, often marks a sharp contrast with the environment beyond. Just a few meters away from the firelight, the landscape may return to near darkness. Trees, rocks, and uneven ground remain present but difficult to distinguish. In this transition zone, the boundary between the known and the unknown becomes very clear. Inside the camp, people share warmth, conversation, and rest. Outside it, the night continues its quiet movement through vegetation, open ground, and distant terrain. Ethnographic observations sometimes describe how individuals occasionally glance toward the darker edges of a camp while speaking or resting. These small moments of attention help maintain awareness of the surroundings without interrupting the calm rhythm of the evening. The group remains relaxed within the familiar center of the camp, yet the mind continues to acknowledge that the wider environment exists beyond the limits of light. Over thousands of years, this simple arrangement, people gathered around a central point of warmth and familiarity, while the landscape fades into darkness beyond, may have become one of the most consistent patterns in human experience. It reflects a balance between two worlds, the shared human space of cooperation and rest, and the larger natural environment that continues its activity throughout the night. As the night continued and the camp settled into quiet rest, the simple structure of the shared space helped shape how early humans experienced the passage of time until morning. Within the circle of companions and the faint glow of embers, the environment felt contained and understandable. People could recognize the breathing of those nearby, hear the soft shifting of someone turning in their bedding, or notice the occasional crackle of wood in the fire. These familiar sounds created a sense of continuity that contrasted with the wider landscape beyond the camp. Outside that small center of human activity, the natural world continued its movement largely unseen. Animals traveled through vegetation, wind moved across open ground, and distant calls echoed through the darkness. Yet the camp itself functioned as a point of stability within this larger environment. Archaeological evidence from prehistoric campsites often suggests that certain locations were used repeatedly across long periods of time. Hearths were rebuilt in the same places, layers of ash accumulated over generations, and clusters of tools appeared around these central areas again and again. Such patterns indicate that early humans may have returned to familiar sites where the landscape offered reliable shelter or resources. These places became known points within the broader terrain locations where people understood the ground, the nearby vegetation, and the general movement of animals in the surrounding area. When night arrived, this familiarity would have been especially valuable. Even if the wider environment disappeared into darkness, the immediate space of the camp remained recognizable. People knew where the fire had burned, where companions rested, and where the boundaries of the camp lay. This knowledge reduced uncertainty and allowed the group to settle more comfortably during the long hours before dawn. Anthropologists studying traditional societies sometimes describe how repeated use of certain campsites creates a form of environmental memory. Individuals remember where to sit, where to store tools, and where the safest resting places are located. Over time, these habits become so familiar that people can move confidently even in low light. Someone waking briefly during the night might know exactly where to reach for a piece of wood to feed the fire, or where to step carefully to avoid disturbing another sleeper. The camp becomes a space shaped not only by physical objects but also by shared memory and routine. This structure allowed early human groups to maintain a sense of order during a time when the surrounding landscape was difficult to observe. Within the camp, the group created a small environment where actions and positions remained predictable. Outside it, the larger world continued its nighttime rhythms without clear visibility. In this way, the organization of the camp helped humans manage the uncertainty of darkness by dividing space into two parts, a familiar center and an unseen beyond. Over many generations, this simple arrangement may have played an important role in how humans adapted to life in environments where night returned every evening. By gathering around central points, repeating the use of known campsites, and maintaining shared awareness within a small space, early human groups created islands of stability in a world that otherwise became difficult to read once the sun disappeared. For most of human history, the experience of night remained closely connected to the natural environment. Darkness arrived with the setting sun, and the small circle of light created by fire defined the limits of human activity until morning. Yet over time, gradual changes in human life began to alter this relationship with the night. As some human groups began to settle in more permanent locations, the spaces where people lived slowly became more structured and protected than the temporary camps of earlier generations. One of the most important changes came with the development of villages and small settlements. When people remained in the same place for longer periods, they began to modify the landscape around them. Simple shelters, storage areas, and shared spaces appeared, gradually transforming open ground into organized living areas. Archaeological research from early agricultural societies shows that houses were often arranged close together, sometimes forming clusters or small communities surrounded by fields or natural barriers. These settlements created a new kind of environment, one where people could rely less on temporary camps and more on stable structures for protection and comfort. With the arrival of more permanent dwellings, the experience of night may have begun to change. Walls made from wood, stone, or packed earth offered a physical boundary between the sleeping space of humans and the wider landscape outside. Although these structures did not eliminate the uncertainties of darkness, they created an additional layer of separation between people and the environment beyond their homes. Inside a shelter, individuals could rest while being partially protected from wind, rain, and the movements of animals outside. This physical barrier likely altered how humans felt during the night. Instead of sleeping directly beneath the open sky, many people began resting within spaces that limited their exposure to the surrounding environment. Anthropologists studying early settlements often note that these structures also helped concentrate human activity into defined areas. Cooking, tool repair, and social interaction increasingly took place within or near homes rather than across scattered campsites. As a result, nighttime life became more closely associated with indoor spaces or shared village areas. The sounds of the environment were still present, but they reached people through the walls of their shelters rather than directly from the open landscape. Over time, these changes may have softened some of the uncertainties that earlier humans experienced during darkness. The presence of walls, nearby neighbors, and familiar village layouts created a sense of collective security. Instead of a small group gathered around a fire in a temporary camp, people now slept within communities where many individuals lived close together. If unusual sounds occurred outside the settlement, they could be heard by many people at once. The presence of multiple households within a village also meant that the nighttime environment was no longer defined by a single circle of firelight. Several fires, lamps, or hearths might illuminate different parts of the settlement, extending the area of visibility beyond what one group alone could create. Despite these changes, the night did not lose all of its uncertainty. The land beyond the village remained largely dark, and the rhythms of animals and weather continued across the wider landscape. Yet the emergence of settled communities marked an important step in how humans adapted to nighttime conditions. By shaping their living spaces and gathering in larger groups, people began to create environments where the challenges of darkness could be managed in new ways. As settlements became more stable and people began living closer together, the physical structure of villages gradually influenced how communities experienced the hours after sunset. In earlier periods, small groups often rested in temporary camps that changed location depending on seasons, water sources, or the movement of animals. In those environments, the surrounding landscape remained largely open, and the boundary between human space and the natural world could be quite thin. With the growth of permanent settlements, however, this boundary slowly became more defined. Houses built from wood, mud, stone, or other available materials created enclosed spaces where people could sleep and store belongings. These structures did more than provide shelter from weather. They also shaped how individuals perceived the environment during the night. When people rested inside walls, the immediate surroundings became quieter and more predictable. Sounds from outside still reached the ears, but they arrived softened by the materials of the shelter. Instead of hearing every movement directly from the landscape, individuals experienced the night through the filter of their homes. Archaeological evidence from early villages often shows that houses were positioned in ways that created shared pathways, central gathering areas, or small courtyards between dwellings. These spaces became part of the daily rhythm of life. During daylight hours, people moved between homes, fields, and communal areas while carrying out tasks such as food preparation, tool making, or caring for animals. When darkness arrived, these same spaces often grew quieter, yet they remained familiar parts of the village. Individuals could still recognize the layout of their surroundings even when visibility decreased. The memory of pathways and structures helped guide movement through the settlement if someone needed to step outside during the night. Another important change involved the presence of neighbors. In earlier camps, a small group of people shared a single resting place. Within a village, many families lived within close distance of one another. This proximity meant that the sounds of human activity could continue even after sunset. A nearby household might still be speaking quietly, tending a small fire, or preparing food late in the evening. These sounds created a subtle background of human presence that did not exist in more isolated camps. The knowledge that others were close by may have influenced how people felt during the dark hours. If an unfamiliar noise occurred outside, it was likely that more than one person in the settlement would hear it. This shared awareness reduced the sense that any single individual faced the night alone. Anthropologists studying early agricultural communities often describe how the layout of settlements encouraged cooperation and mutual observation. Homes positioned near one another allowed people to respond collectively to unexpected events, whether those events involved weather, animals, or other groups of humans. At night, this arrangement may have extended the sense of security that earlier human groups found when gathering closely around a fire. Instead of a single illuminated space within a dark landscape, the village created a network of small, connected spaces where people lived and rested together. Over time, these changes may have gradually reshaped the human relationship with darkness. The night remained a period when the natural world outside the settlement was difficult to see. Yet within the boundaries of the village, the presence of walls, familiar pathways, and nearby companions created an environment where uncertainty could be managed more easily than in the open camps of earlier generations. As villages became more common, and human communities remained in the same places for longer periods of time, the nighttime environment gradually began to change in another subtle way. In earlier periods, a single fire might have been the primary source of light for a small group resting together. Within a settlement, however, many households maintained their own hearths or small fires. As evening arrived, multiple points of light could appear across the village. Each house might contain a small flame used for cooking, warmth, or quiet activity before sleep. From a distance, these lights formed scattered glows across the settlement, extending human visibility beyond what a single campfire could provide. This network of light did not transform the entire night into daylight, but it did expand the areas where people could see and move safely after sunset. Someone stepping outside a house might still recognize the outline of nearby buildings, pathways, or storage areas illuminated by the light from neighboring homes. The village became a place where darkness existed, yet it was broken by pockets of visibility created by human activity. Archaeological evidence from early agricultural societies often reveals traces of hearths inside dwellings or within shared courtyard spaces. These hearths served as centers of daily life, providing warmth and light during the evening hours. Even after cooking was finished, the embers might continue glowing softly for some time. In this way, the simple presence of many fires within a settlement gradually changed how people experienced nighttime. Instead of a single illuminated circle surrounded by darkness, the village contained several small centers of light that extended human awareness across a wider area. Anthropologists studying traditional settlements sometimes describe how nighttime sounds also shift within these environments. The presence of multiple households means that small human activities may continue long after sunset. A family might speak quietly near a fire, someone might adjust tools or prepare materials for the next day, and children might still be awake in the early evening. These subtle signs of human life create a gentle background of sound and light that distinguishes a village from the open camps of earlier times. The night is still present, but it is no longer defined entirely by darkness and silence. Instead, it becomes a shared period when the community gradually slows its activity while remaining connected through nearby households. This transformation may have influenced how people felt about the hours after sunset. The presence of neighbors, walls, and familiar structures created a layered environment where the unknown landscape existed beyond the settlement, while the village itself remained a place of recognizable activity. Even when individuals rested inside their homes, they remained part of a wider network of human presence. Sounds or light from nearby dwellings served as reminders that others were awake or resting nearby. Over long periods of time, such changes may have softened some of the uncertainties that earlier humans experienced when facing the night in small isolated camps. Darkness still surrounded the village, and the natural world beyond remained active and unseen. Yet within the settlement, human cooperation and shared space had begun to reshape the experience of nighttime. What was once a small island of firelight within darkness had slowly expanded into a community of light spread across a familiar landscape. For thousands of years after the first villages appeared, the human experience of night continued to change slowly. Fire remained the primary source of light, but over time people developed additional ways to extend visibility after sunset. Small lamps fueled by animal fat, plant oils, or other natural materials began to appear in many parts of the world. Archaeological discoveries from ancient civilizations have revealed clay lamps designed to hold burning oil, as well as simple containers where a wick could draw fuel upward to produce a steady flame. These lamps produced far less light than modern electric lighting, yet they allowed individuals to illuminate small indoor spaces long after the sun had disappeared. With the use of lamps, the boundary between day and night began to soften slightly within human homes. Instead of relying only on a central hearth or fire, people could place a small source of light closer to where they worked or rested. This made certain evening activities easier to continue. Writing, weaving, tool repair, or food preparation could sometimes take place within the limited glow of a lamp. In many early societies, however, these activities remained modest and short-lived because fuel for lamps was often valuable. Burning oil or fat required resources that could not always be used freely. As a result, people still tended to follow the natural rhythm of daylight. When darkness deepened and the lamps burned low, most individuals eventually settled into rest until morning. Historical records from ancient cultures often describe nighttime as a quieter period compared with the busy hours of daylight. Streets and open spaces within settlements became calm once most fires and lamps were extinguished. In some cities of the ancient world, guards or watchmen moved through the streets at night to observe unusual activity or respond to emergencies. Their presence reflected the continued uncertainty associated with darkness, even within developed settlements. Without bright lighting, much of the environment remained hidden once the sun disappeared. Houses and buildings created shelter, yet the spaces between them could still fall into shadow. Travelers moving through towns at night often carried small lanterns to see the ground ahead. These portable lights allowed individuals to move carefully through familiar paths, though the surrounding environment remained dim. Anthropologists and historians often emphasize that before the modern era, most human activity still depended heavily on daylight. Even in complex societies with lamps and lanterns, the brightness of these lights was limited. The natural world beyond homes and streets remained largely dark. People adjusted their routines accordingly, concentrating most work during daylight hours and allowing nighttime to serve primarily as a period of rest or quiet activity. Yet the introduction of lamps marked an important step in the long transformation of the human relationship with darkness. Each small flame represented another attempt to extend human presence into the night. Within homes, workshops, and public spaces, these lights created pockets of visibility where people could continue their lives after sunset. Although the wider landscape remained dim, the gradual spread of artificial lighting began to reshape how communities organized their evenings. Night was no longer defined solely by the fading of daylight. Instead, it became a time when humans could selectively bring light into the spaces they occupied, slowly altering the ancient balance between darkness and human awareness. As lamps and small lanterns became more common in many parts of the world, the relationship between humans and the night continued to change in gradual ways. These new sources of light did not eliminate darkness across entire landscapes, but they allowed people to illuminate specific spaces where daily life continued after sunset. Within homes, a small lamp placed near a table or work area could extend certain activities into the evening hours. In workshops, craftsmen sometimes used lamplight to finish delicate tasks that required careful attention. In temples, halls, or gathering places, rows of lamps could create a gentle glow that allowed people to remain together even after the sky had grown dark. Despite these developments, the brightness produced by early lamps remained limited. The light from a single flame reached only a short distance, often illuminating just a small circle around the wick. Even when several lamps were used together, the surrounding environment quickly faded into shadow beyond their glow. Historical descriptions of ancient cities often emphasize how dim nighttime streets could appear once the lamps inside homes were extinguished. Travelers moving through these streets sometimes carried their own lanterns to help guide their steps. The lanterns created small moving circles of light that revealed the ground immediately ahead while leaving the rest of the environment largely hidden. Because light remained scarce and fuel required effort to obtain, most communities continued to follow routines shaped by the natural cycle of daylight. When evening arrived, people often gathered briefly for meals, conversation, or simple work under the glow of lamps or fires. As the night grew deeper and the lamps burned low, activity gradually slowed. Individuals returned to rest until the sun rose again. Anthropologists studying historical patterns of daily life frequently note that before the widespread use of modern lighting, nighttime activity remained modest compared with the busy hours of daylight. In many places, the dark streets and open spaces between buildings became quiet for much of the night. The limited range of lamplight meant that people preferred to remain within familiar indoor spaces rather than traveling long distances in darkness. Even within towns and cities, darkness still defined much of the environment beyond the small pockets of light created by human activity. This continued presence of darkness influenced how communities organized protection and observation during the night. In some societies, watchmen or guards were responsible for walking through streets to ensure that fires remained controlled and that unusual disturbances could be addressed. Their work reflected the understanding that visibility remained limited even in settlements where lamps were present. The wider landscape beyond the reach of these lights remained largely unseen until morning. Over time, however, the steady use of lamps and lanterns gradually reshaped human expectations about nighttime environments. Each small flame extended the reach of human perception just a little farther. Homes, gathering places, and certain public areas could remain active after sunset in ways that earlier generations might not have experienced. Although darkness still surrounded these illuminated spaces, the growing presence of artificial light marked another step in the long human effort to understand and manage the night. For most of human history, even with the use of lamps, lanterns, and fires, the night remained largely dark. The light produced by these sources was fragile and limited. A flame could flicker in the wind, consume its fuel quickly, or fade to embers after a few hours. The surrounding landscape, fields, forests, rivers, and distant roads remained beyond the reach of these small lights. For this reason, the rhythm of human life continued to follow the pattern established over thousands of years. activity during daylight and gradual quiet after sunset. Yet during the last 2 centuries, a remarkable transformation began to take place. Humans developed new technologies capable of producing light in ways that earlier generations could scarcely imagine. The spread of gaslighting in cities during the 19th century introduced a new form of illumination that could brighten streets and public spaces more reliably than oil lamps. Rows of gas lamps appeared along roads, bridges, and squares in many growing cities. These lights were brighter and more stable than the small flames people had relied upon for centuries. For the first time, certain urban spaces could remain visibly illuminated long after the sun had disappeared. Even so, the most dramatic shift came with the development of electric lighting. When electricity began to power lamps in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the relationship between humans and night changed in ways that had no parallel in earlier history. Electric bulbs could produce light far stronger and steadier than any flame. They did not require constant fuel in the same way as oil or wood, and they could remain illuminated for many hours. Gradually, electric lighting spread from city centres into homes, workplaces, and streets across much of the world. This change allowed people to extend their daily activities into the nighttime hours with far fewer limitations than before. Shops remained open after sunset, factories continued operating into the evening, and streets could be safely navigated under bright lamps. From an evolutionary perspective, however, this transformation occurred extremely recently. For hundreds of thousands of years, humans experienced the night as a period when the natural world became darker and more uncertain. Artificial lighting existed only in small, localized forms such as fires and lamps. The widespread presence of bright electric light has been part of human life for only a tiny fraction of that long history. Anthropologists and historians sometimes emphasize how quickly this transition occurred compared with the slow pace of earlier changes. In just a few generations, large portions of the world moved from environments where darkness dominated most nighttime spaces to environments where artificial light now fills homes, streets, and cities. Despite this transformation, the human body and brain still carry the biological rhythms shaped by those earlier millennia. Our eyes, sleep cycles, and patterns of attention developed in conditions where daylight and darkness strongly structured daily life. The modern world has altered those conditions dramatically, yet the underlying biological systems continue to reflect their ancient origins. In this sense, the arrival of electric light did more than illuminate the night. It marked the beginning of a new relationship between humans and darkness, one where technology could reshape an experience that had remained largely unchanged throughout most of human history. Although modern technology has dramatically transformed the night, the human mind and body still carry traces of the long history that came before electric light. For most of human existence, darkness was a regular and meaningful part of daily life. Each evening brought the gradual fading of visual information, the shift toward listening and quiet awareness, and the gathering of people within small spaces of warmth and light. These patterns repeated themselves across countless generations, shaping how humans perceived the environment and responded to uncertainty. Even though the modern world often surrounds people with bright artificial illumination, the biological systems that evolved during those earlier times remain largely the same. The human circadian rhythm, which helps regulate sleep and wakefulness, still responds strongly to patterns of light and darkness. When daylight fades, the brain begins releasing chemical signals that encourage the body to rest. When morning light appears, those signals gradually shift again, promoting alertness and activity. This cycle developed over hundreds of thousands of years while humans lived in environments where natural light was the primary guide for daily life. Anthropologists and sleep researchers often note that many people today continue to experience subtle echoes of those ancient patterns. A quiet room in darkness can sometimes heighten awareness of small sounds. An unfamiliar noise at night may capture attention more quickly than the same sound heard during the day. These reactions do not necessarily reflect fear. Instead, they may reveal the brain's long history of responding carefully when the environment becomes harder to observe. The senses adjust, attention shifts, and the mind becomes more attentive to signals that might otherwise pass unnoticed. Modern lighting has changed the practical challenges of nighttime environments in profound ways. Cities glow with constant illumination, homes remain bright long after sunset, and many people continue their activities late into the evening. Yet even within these illuminated spaces, the deeper rhythms of the human body still reflect a world where darkness once played a central role. Sleep patterns, sensory awareness, and emotional responses to uncertainty all carry influences shaped by the long evolutionary past of the species. Historians sometimes remind us that electric lighting has existed for only a brief moment compared with the vast timeline of human life on Earth. For tens of thousands of years, humans lived under skies where the stars and the moon provided the only natural illumination once the sun disappeared. Fires, lamps, and lanterns created small islands of light, but the wider landscape remained largely unseen until morning. In this context, the modern ability to illuminate entire cities at night represents a profound departure from the conditions under which the human mind originally developed. Understanding this long history does not mean that darkness should be viewed as something to fear in the present. Instead, it offers a perspective on how deeply human perception is connected to the environments in which our ancestors lived. The quiet attentiveness that many people feel in dim environments may reflect a form of inherited awareness rather than a flaw in human behavior. Over countless evenings in the distant past, that awareness helped individuals remain connected to the rhythms of the natural world, even when much of it lay beyond the limits of sight. Even in a world filled with artificial light, moments of darkness still reveal how closely human perception remains connected to older patterns of awareness. When lights are dimmed and the surrounding environment grows quiet, many people notice subtle changes in how their senses respond. Small sounds become more noticeable. Movements in the corner of the eye draw attention more quickly, and the mind often begins to imagine what might exist just beyond the visible space. These reactions are rarely dramatic. More often they appear as a gentle shift in attention, as if the brain quietly remembers that the world can still move outside the boundaries of what the eyes can clearly observe. For most of human history, this experience would have been familiar every evening. Darkness was not unusual or rare. It was a natural phase of the daily cycle that shaped how people organized their lives. When daylight disappeared, activity slowed, communities gathered together, and the senses adapted to a different kind of environment. Listening replaced distant observation, shared spaces replaced wide exploration, and awareness of subtle signals became more important than constant visual clarity. These adjustments helped early humans remain connected to the surrounding landscape while conserving energy during the long hours before dawn. In modern societies, the presence of electric lighting has changed many of these patterns. Streets remain illuminated, homes stay bright well into the evening, and work or travel can continue long after the sun has set. Yet the deeper structure of the human mind still reflects a much older relationship with the night. When people enter environments where light fades again, such as quiet countryside areas, forests, or places far from cities, they often rediscover the same sensory adjustments that guided earlier generations. The eyes search for faint shapes, the ears listen carefully for unfamiliar sounds, and attention gradually settles on the immediate surroundings. These experiences remind us that the human brain did not evolve in permanently illuminated environments. Instead, it developed in a world where darkness returned every day and where the natural environment continued its rhythms beyond the limits of human vision. Anthropologists sometimes describe this connection as a form of environmental memory carried within human biology. The patterns of sleep, awareness, and caution that helped earlier humans navigate the night remain present even when modern technology changes the physical conditions around us. This perspective offers a different way of thinking about the ancient relationship between humans and darkness. Rather than viewing the night solely as something that frightened early people, it may be more accurate to see it as a teacher that shaped human attention and cooperation. The limitations of darkness encourage people to gather together, listen carefully, and rely on shared awareness. These habits supported the development of social bonds and communication that became central to human survival. In this sense, the long history of humans facing the night may have played a quiet role in shaping the way communities formed and knowledge was shared across generations. Even today, when artificial light allows people to move comfortably through the dark, traces of that ancient relationship remain visible in the way our senses respond when the lights grow dim. As the final hours of night slowly approach the return of morning light, the long story of humans and darkness reveals something quiet but meaningful about our species. For hundreds of thousands of years, night arrived as a predictable transformation of the world. The sun disappeared, the landscape faded into shadow, and human awareness shifted inward toward the small spaces where people gathered together. Around fires, inside shelters, or within the shared quiet of a village, early humans learned to rest while remaining gently connected to the environment beyond their sight. Darkness did not stop the natural world. Animals continued to move through forests and grasslands. Winds traveled across valleys, and distant sounds carried through the air. In this environment, humans learned to adapt by adjusting their senses, their behavior, and their communities. The limitations of night encouraged attentiveness rather than constant action. People listened more carefully, remained close to one another, and organized their living spaces in ways that created small islands of familiarity within a much larger landscape. Over time, these habits shaped important features of human life. The need to remain aware of subtle signals helped refine the human ability to interpret sound and movement. The practice of gathering together during darkness strengthened social bonds and communication within groups. The rhythm of daylight activity, followed by nighttime rest, shaped the biological cycles that still guide human sleep today. In this way, the long history of humans facing the night quietly influenced the development of perception, cooperation, and daily routine. Modern technology has changed many aspects of this ancient relationship. Electric lighting now allows people to illuminate entire cities, travel safely through streets after sunset, and continue work or entertainment late into the evening. The darkness that once surrounded human camps for most of the night has been greatly reduced in many parts of the world. Yet the deeper biological and psychological systems that evolved in earlier environments remain part of who we are. Our eyes still adjust slowly to dim light. Our sleep cycles continue to follow patterns influenced by the rise and fall of daylight. Our attention still shifts when the environment grows quiet and visibility fades. These responses are reminders that the human mind developed in a world where night was not simply the absence of light but a distinct phase of life on Earth. Understanding this history offers a different way of thinking about the ancient fear often associated with darkness. What early humans experienced was not constant terror but a form of respectful awareness. The night required patience, cooperation, and careful listening to the environment. Those who adapted to these conditions were more likely to survive and pass their knowledge to the next generation. In this sense, the long history of humans living with darkness helped shape the very abilities that define our species today. The message that emerges from this history is simple but meaningful. Human beings did not overcome the night by eliminating it completely. Instead, our ancestors learned to live within its limits. They created light where they could, relied on one another when uncertainty grew, and allowed the rhythm of darkness to guide rest and reflection. Even now, in a world where artificial light can push back the night almost anywhere, the deeper patterns of our minds still carry the memory of those earlier times. And perhaps the most thoughtful question to carry into the quiet hours before sleep is this. In a world where humans have learned to illuminate the night, how much of that ancient darkness still lives quietly within the way we sense and understand the world around us?